Negev, a scorching furnace in southern Israel, doesn't just drain the life out of every plant that tries to grow here, it pushes human patience to its absolute limit. When familiar solutions led only to dead ends, an idea emerged that many in the agricultural community dismissed as reckless, unrealistic, even delusional, releasing millions of bees directly into the desert. These tiny engineers, after all, had evolved to survive precisely where most life is forced to give up. What happened next didn't resemble any scenario humans had predicted. And here, in the Negev, a place long considered impossible to tame, the story of how bees began rewriting the future of the desert quietly began. Israel is widely regarded as one of the world's leaders in water technology. The country has spent over $30 billion building vast pipeline networks across the desert, turning seawater into fresh water and pumping it hundreds of kilometers deep into the Negev. Every patch of green that survives here requires not only water, but also electricity, constant maintenance, and years of ongoing operational costs. Yet even in a place sustained by some of the most advanced irrigation technology on Earth, entire ecosystems refuse to stay. The moment the water stops flowing, life pulls back just as quickly, and the Negev reverts to its true nature: dry, harsh, and unforgiving. If there is one tree that has kept the Negev desert from slipping completely into dead land, it is Acacia raddiana. This is not an ornamental tree, nor an agricultural crop. It is the ecological backbone of the entire desert system. With roots capable of reaching depths of 30 to 40 meters, acacia can tap into rare underground water pockets. As a legume, it also fixes nitrogen, gradually turning nutrient-poor soil into a foundation that other forms of life can cling to. As long as a single acacia survives, an entire ecological chain can form around it. Insects find flowers, birds find food, small animals find shade, and soil microorganisms begin to reactivate. But when acacia disappears, that entire network collapses with it. Acacia raddiana can withstand extreme heat and drought, standing in the desert for decades. But endurance does not equal self-sustainability. Even as the keystone species of the Negev, its life cycle depends on an extraordinarily fragile moment. Acacia flowers bloom only briefly each year. If they are not pollinated in time, the flowers fall, seeds never form, and regeneration stops at the very first step. That is why in the Negev, the fate of acacia is not decided underground, but on the wings of native bees. The bee chosen for this experiment is not one people are familiar with. It doesn't produce honey, doesn't live in colonies, has no hive to harvest, and cannot be integrated into any industrial beekeeping system. Its name is Andrena sinai, a native bee of the Negev, one that spends most of its life underground. Each female lives alone, digging her own system of tunnels deep into the desert soil, where temperatures are far more stable than the violently fluctuating surface above. These bees emerge only during the briefest windows of the day, at dawn and at dusk, when dew has not yet disappeared. In silence, Andrena sinai moves among acacia flowers, then vanishes back beneath the sand, leaving behind tunnels so small that no one ever paid attention to them. For years, this bee existed right here in the Negev, unnoticed and dismissed as irrelevant. No one on the research team believed the bees could survive if they were released directly into the Negev. In the history of ecological experiments that had almost never worked, this desert doesn't need much time to kill a small creature. Just a few hours under the brutal sun are enough. So if the experiment was going to fail, it would fail from the very first moment. That realization forced the team to change their approach. Instead of trying to shield the bees from the desert, they decided to change what the bees would encounter first. Not sand, but dew. Before a single bee was released, the Negev was prepared for a different role. No longer a scorching surface, but a place capable of holding on to the brief moisture of the night. Dark basalt strips were arranged to absorb heat during the day and release it slowly. The soil was treated just enough to retain moisture for a few critical hours, and nesting sites were positioned precisely along nighttime wind paths. The goal was not to plant trees and not to create an artificial water source. The goal was to keep dew in place long enough for a living organism to act. Only once this invisible system began to function did they take the final step, releasing 2.4 million Andrena sinai bees into a desert that had never been waiting for them. During the first 2 weeks, everything unfolded exactly as the most pessimistic scenarios had predicted. The experiment staggered right out of the gate. More than 40% of the bees died from heat shock and dehydration, sandstorms buried nest entrances overnight, and many dew traps were destroyed before they had a chance to function. On the surface, the Negev revealed its familiar nature, a machine that eliminates life without mercy. Local media quickly labeled the project a cruel experiment, while some scientists argued that the research team was wasting biological resources on a hypothesis too fragile to survive the desert. To most observers, failure seemed only a matter of time. But while all eyes were fixed on the cracked ground and the disappearing bees, sensors buried deep below the surface began recording something unexpected. In areas where bees were present, moisture levels in the deeper soil layers were noticeably higher, even though nighttime dew levels were exactly the same. No additional water had been introduced. No new technical intervention had taken place. Only one thing had changed. The water was no longer disappearing immediately. Those contradictory signals forced the research team to stop, not to salvage the experiment, but to find out what the bees were actually doing beneath the sand. They did not argue through hypotheses, nor did they search for answers in meeting rooms. Instead, they divided the Negev itself into 3 sections. 3 areas nearly identical in terrain, nighttime wind direction, and dew formation. One area was left untouched with no intervention, allowing the desert to fully express its inherent harshness. A second area was equipped with dew traps and planted with acacia seeds, representing the way humans typically try to help nature through engineering. Only the third area included an element that few had previously considered significant: Andrena sinai bees. From that moment on, all subjective impressions were set aside. The desert began to be read through data: soil moisture at different depths, day-night temperature shifts, and the earliest signs of microbial activity, and symbiotic fungi. And most importantly, every acacia flower was followed all the way to its final outcome. Either it formed a seed or it disappeared back into the sand. That difference did not come from the measuring equipment, but from what was quietly happening beneath the sand. There, Andrena sinai was doing something that had gone unnoticed for years. Each female bee excavates her own burrow system, typically 15 to 30 centimeters deep, with small side branches spreading through the soil like capillaries. The tunnel walls are compacted by the bee's constant movement, while the tunnel floor is angled just enough to allow nighttime dew to seep downward instead of pooling on the surface and evaporating. When dew forms, usually lasting only 2 to 3 hours before sunrise, these tunnels act as passive channels, carrying moisture more than 20 centimeters below the surface, past the hottest layer of topsoil. Inside the nest, stored pollen for the larvae and organic-rich waste create rare moisture-retaining pockets. Soil surrounding the burrow can hold water for 24 to 72 hours, instead of just a few minutes as in bare desert ground. That brief window is long enough for microorganisms to reactivate, for symbiotic fungi to attach to roots, and for the physical structure of the soil itself to begin shifting away from a purely desert state. 3 months in, the experiment crossed a threshold it could not reverse. The data showed that the differences being observed were no longer within measurement error or random desert fluctuation. In areas where bees were present, soil moisture at deeper layers remained about 35% higher than in surrounding zones. And more importantly, that moisture did not collapse immediately once the sun rose. At the same time, microbial density in the soil increased by nearly 5-fold, accompanied by the sustained presence of symbiotic fungi around the roots of young acacia trees. These were no longer brief signals that came and went. The indicators persisted, remaining stable across multiple day-night cycles. When the flowering season arrived, the outcome became clear without the need for further interpretation. In areas without bees, most acacia flowers dropped before forming seeds. In contrast, in zones where Andrena sinai was present, over 60% of flowers set seed more than 10 times, higher than in the control areas. 1 year later, the desert area chosen for the experiment no longer resembled the surrounding arid land. Vegetation cover had visibly thickened, several times denser than in areas that had never seen the presence of bees. During the day, ground surface temperatures were 6 to 8 degrees Celsius lower, a difference large enough to slow evaporation and retain precious moisture in the soil. Beneath the surface, Acacia began doing something it had been unable to do for years, fixing nitrogen and rebuilding the soil. Microbial activity increased sharply, and stable networks of symbiotic fungi formed around the roots of young trees, reconnecting patches of land that had once been biologically isolated into a continuous living system. Most importantly, the native bee population did not decline as initially feared. The bees reproduced on their own, sustained themselves, and became a permanent part of the newly formed landscape. Then another sign appeared, quiet but unmistakable. Herds of Dorcas gazelles began to return. They were not drawn by fresh leaves or shade. What brought them back were the first acacia pods falling onto the sand. Acacia seeds passed through their digestive systems, were carried far from the parent trees, and dropped onto land already restructured by bees, where moisture, microbes, and soil structure were sufficient for new life to take root. For the first time in many years, acacia trees no longer existed as isolated ancient survivors. The success in the Negev is not a formula that can be copied at will, and that is precisely what makes this experiment credible. It worked only because every piece was in the right place. The bees involved were not foreign species introduced on a gamble, but native pollinators that have evolved for thousands of years to survive under these exact harsh conditions. The timing of their release was also deliberate. A narrow window when acacia trees were in bloom, where a delay of even a few days could have pushed the entire regeneration process off course. More importantly, the Negev was not completely dead. Beneath what looked like lifeless sand, the soil still held seed banks and dormant microorganisms, waiting for a signal strong enough to wake them up. The bees did not create life out of nothing. They activated what was already there, but trapped. In places where soil biology has been erased, where native plants have vanished entirely, or where bees no longer belong to the ecosystem, this kind of recovery would not happen. The Negev was not saved by luck, it survived because it still had the capacity to save itself. The flow of restoration begins with the very logs a beaver holds in its mouth. It's no coincidence that ecologists call them ecosystem engineers. Every bite, every branch they carry home sets the stage for a scale of rebuilding no other animal can achieve. Beaver dams don't block water completely. They slow it down, allowing it to spill sideways, soak into the soil, and form new wetlands. Within just a few weeks, sediments trap nutrients, reeds take root, willows and aspens sprout, and insects return in waves of renewal. The ponds created by beavers become oases in dry landscapes, places where mule deer, moose, grouse, mallards, and countless bird species stop to rest. Small fish find refuge, insects flourish, and riverbanks are stabilized naturally without excavators or concrete. Ecologists call beavers a keystone species, a pillar that can keep an entire system from collapsing. This power was once proven quite dramatically in the Czech Republic, where a $1.2 million dam project stalled for 7 years due to paperwork, and a single beaver colony ended up building a dam in the exact location, creating a pond and restoring wetland conditions so perfectly that officials admitted, "The beavers did the job for us for free." The water held back by these dams creates a layer of protection as scientists never expected, a natural shield against wildfires. In surveys across Washington and Idaho, valleys with beavers appeared as fire-resistant oases in landscapes cracked by drought. NASA satellite analysis from 2020 showed that areas with beaver dams retain 3 times more moisture than places without them, significantly slowing the spread of flames. During the 2015 Twist Fire, many ponds were scorched on one side while the other remained green, and firefighters even used the pond water to battle the blaze. The fire resilience of beaver ponds comes from how their structures spread water across the landscape, soaking the soil and preserving a cool layer of mud that creates damp depressions fire can't consume. As a result, beaver ponds act as ecological fortresses in the midst of increasingly severe fire seasons. The rivers being restored today aren't just bringing back salmon and reviving parched valleys. They're also reshaping how people view beavers. Once seen as troublemakers that cut down trees, flood yards, and damage levees, beavers in many states were pushed to the edge of extinction, surviving only in small pockets hidden away in remote wetlands. Washington chose a different path. Instead of trying to suppress their instincts, the state decided to turn those instincts into a force for natural recovery. Programs like the Methau Beaver Project and the Tulalip Beaver Initiative now function as ecosystem reconstruction teams. They respond to every call about nuisance beavers, humanely trap each animal, run health checks, and relocate them to depleted watersheds, places where their instinct to build dams becomes the most valuable resource. In 2023 alone, more than 150 relocations helped create dozens of new dam complexes, slowing streams, adding shade, lowering temperatures, and reopening lost migration corridors for juvenile salmon. And from there, watersheds once written off as hopeless finally have a chance to regain their first rhythms of life. The Negev experiment did not deliver a new miracle. Instead, it returned us to an older, often forgotten perspective. Ecosystems are not sustained by grand solutions, but by countless small links precisely connected to one another. When humans learn to listen to the quietest organisms, nature does not need to be forced back to life. It only needs to be activated in the right way. The story of the Negev does not end in this desert. It opens a larger question for a world that is steadily drying out. If you want to keep exploring the invisible engineers that quietly run our planet, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Mandarin Tech to join us in the stories ahead.